The wind howled through broken window panes as Daniel pushed open the rusted gate. It creaked like a cry from the past, protesting the arrival of a stranger who once called this place home. The old house stood there, half-eaten by time, its wood swollen with rain, its paint flaked into oblivion. Everything smelled of dust, mold, and memory. It had been 37 years since Daniel had last seen this house. He left as a boy and returned as a man with lines on his face and weight in his chest. The lawyer's letter in his pocket felt heavier than it should. The house was now legally his, an inheritance from someone long gone. Someone he didn't think about anymore, until now. His footsteps echoed through the rotting floorboards. The air was thick, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Fragments of forgotten life were everywhere, faded photographs, broken toys, an empty teacup still resting on a shelf. Every object whispered secrets he never understood. He stood in the living room staring at the fireplace where he once sat beside his mother. He couldn't remember her voice, not clearly. Just the shape of her smile and the way she smelled like lavender and smoke. She left him when he was 6. No goodbye. No explanation. Only silence. And then, a life in foster homes. Daniel clenched his fists. He didn't come for closure. He came because the law demanded it. But something about the house, something was pulling him, like a forgotten thread, waiting to be unraveled. He walked toward the staircase. It groaned under his weight, each step deeper into memory. Upstairs, the air grew colder. The hallway stretched like a tunnel to the past. And then he saw it. The attic door was ajar. Something was waiting for him. Daniel hesitated at the attic door. A soft draft breathed through the crack, stirring the dust in the hallway. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges sighing like old bones. A narrow staircase led upward into darkness. He climbed it, one careful step at a time, his hand trailing along the splintered railing. The attic smelled of age, wood, paper, and something faintly sweet, like forgotten perfume. Sunlight pierced through a single circular window, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Boxes lay piled in corners. A rocking horse stood frozen in mid-motion, its eyes chipped, staring at nothing. Daniel's eyes moved over the artifacts, like a museum visitor studying someone else's life. But this was his, or had been made in case, before the silence, before the questions. He crouched beside an old trunk, its leather straps frayed with time. When he opened it, a rush of cold air spilled out, as if the past had been sealed inside. Inside were children's clothes, his maybe. A music box, shaped like a crescent moon. A folded blanket with a stitched name, Daniel. His throat tightened. Beneath the blanket was a small wooden box, lacquered and worn. It had no lock, just a simple clasp. He unhooked it and lifted the lid. Letters, photographs, a locket. And a single envelope, yellowed with time, addressed in delicate handwriting. To my son Daniel, in case I never get to say goodbye. He froze. The world narrowed. His fingers trembled as he held the envelope. It was sealed, untouched. She never sent it, but she wrote it. And now, nearly 4 decades later, he held the only piece of his mother that had ever tried to speak. He sank to the floor, the letter clutched in both hands. The attic was silent. Even the wind had paused, as if waiting. With one deep breath, he began to open it. The paper crackled softly, as Daniel unfolded the letter, as if it too had waited a lifetime to be touched. The ink had faded into sepia tones, the handwriting graceful but trembling. It began simply, "My dear Daniel, if you're reading this, I never made it back to you." His breath caught. "You were 6 when I left. I didn't say goodbye, and for that I am sorry in ways words cannot hold. Every day, I imagined how that broke your heart, and it broke mine too." Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the lines as he read. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because someone dangerous was watching us. A man I once trusted, your father. I thought I could protect you by staying, but I was wrong. So I ran. I thought if I disappeared he'd stop. That he'd let you live a normal life." Daniel froze. His father? He'd always imagined him as a ghost, a blurry figure in a story no one told. Now he had a name, and a reason to fear him. I went to the police. I begged for protection. But nothing worked. Every place I went, he found me. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I gave you up hoping you'd be safe in someone else's care. I watched from far away. Birthdays, school plays, moments only a mother should witness. I never stopped watching. I never stopped loving. Daniel's hands trembled. The letter shook with him. If I died before reaching you, I wanted you to know this. You were never abandoned. You were protected. And I loved you more than the world will ever understand. There was no signature, just a small heart drawn beside his name. He read it again. And again. The attic around him faded away. He wasn't a man reading a letter. He was a child again, desperate for answers, finally receiving them. For the first time in 37 years, the silence had broken, but the questions had only begun. Daniel descended from the attic, as if emerging from a dream. The letter rested in his hands, fragile and powerful like something holy. The house, once silent and hollow, now seemed to hum with unseen memories. Every floorboard creaked with meaning. Every shadow held weight. He sat on the worn-out couch in the living room, the same one he suddenly remembered, where his mother used to read him stories at night. The words from the letter echoed in his mind. His mother hadn't abandoned him, she ran to save him from his father, but no one had ever told him. The foster homes he passed through spoke of her as a mystery. Your mother disappeared, they said. Always vague, always cold. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking, and typed, Margaret Hill missing 1986. A few results surfaced. One led to a faded newspaper clipping. Grainy and scanned poorly. Her photo, young, soft-eyed, holding a boy with chestnut hair. The headline read, Young mother vanishes after accusing ex-husband of threats. His stomach dropped. He clicked on a second result, an old missing persons database. There she was. Margaret Hill. No updates, no closure. Just a name among thousands, forgotten by time. But something didn't make sense. If she disappeared, how did the letter end up in the attic? She claimed to have watched over him from afar. But who placed that envelope in the trunk? Had she returned? Had someone else kept it safe? He glanced around. The house seemed to breathe, as if it still held secrets. As if it wanted him to dig deeper. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number, he answered. Daniel? A woman's voice. Older, but soft. Familiar and distant all at once. He froze. If you've read the letter, then it's time you learn the rest. Click. The line went dead. Daniel stared at his phone screen, heart racing. The call had lasted seconds, but it had shattered the silence of decades. That voice, it wasn't just a stranger. It felt connected, familiar, like a melody from a dream he couldn't fully remember. He tried to redial. No answer. He called again. Nothing. Was it her? Was it really his mother? Was she still alive? He gripped the letter tighter, now wrinkled from the sweat in his palms. Questions flooded him. Why now? Why had she waited all these years? Why not just come forward, explain everything in person, unless she couldn't? Daniel stood up and began pacing the room, the floor creaking under his feet. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe she was hiding. Maybe someone else made that call. Maybe the danger still lingered. He opened the envelope again. Nothing else inside. No address. No clue. Just a single page and a small heart she'd drawn beside his name. Then, almost as if guided by instinct, he turned the envelope over. There, faintly imprinted on the inside flap, was a watermark. Marigold Hospice, Bayport County. It hit him like a punch. A hospice. Was she dying, or had she already died? He rushed back to his laptop and searched the name. One result appeared, a small, underfunded hospice center 3 hours away. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys, stuffed the letter in his jacket, and locked the door behind him. Rain began to fall as he pulled out of the driveway, soft at first, then harder, like the sky itself was weeping for lost time. As the city lights faded behind him, Daniel felt something shift inside. For years, he had built walls to protect himself from pain. Now those walls were crumbling one memory at a time. If that voice was real, if she was alive, this might be his only chance to finally look into the eyes of the woman who had never stopped loving him. And if she wasn't? Then he needed answers. Either way, he wasn't turning back. The rain didn't stop. It clung to the windshield like a curtain, blurring the road ahead. Daniel drove in silence, guided by the glowing blue line on his GPS, and the weight of decades pressing against his chest. Every mile felt like peeling away another layer of the past. He replayed the voice in his head. Soft. Controlled. Tired. If it was her, she had aged. Of course, nearly 40 years had passed. But there was a warmth behind the weariness, a kind of love you don't fake. The road narrowed. As he entered Bayport County, fog began to roll in, painting the world in shades of gray. Ahead, a sign barely visible through the mist. Marigold Hospice, 2 miles. His hands trembled. The building appeared like a ghost at the end of the road, small, old, and surrounded by weeping willows. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. The rain softened, as if giving him a moment of quiet before the storm inside. He stepped out. The hospice smelled like antiseptic and lavender. Inside, a nurse greeted him. Mid-50s. Kind eyes. Tired smile. "Can I help you?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm looking for someone. I think she may have been here recently." Her name was Margaret Hill. The woman blinked, then her eyes softened. "Are you Daniel?" His heart stopped. "Yes," she nodded slowly. "She told me if a man came asking to give him this." She handed him a small envelope. No name, no seal. His fingers shook as he opened it. Inside was a photo. Faded but clear. His mother, older now, sitting by a window. In her hands the very same letter he had found in the attic. Behind her, taped to the wall, was a photograph of him. Taken last year. One he never shared. She had been watching. All this time. Then the nurse said something that made his knees weaken. She passed away last night. Peacefully. Daniel felt the world blur. Not from rain. From tears. Too late. He had found her. But time had stolen the reunion. Still, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It had a voice, a face, and a final goodbye. Daniel sat in the hospice hallway for what felt like hours, the letter and photo resting on his lap. The rain had stopped, but inside him the storm still raged. He never got to hear her voice in person. Never got to ask why. Never got to say "I forgive you." But in that moment, grief didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like proof that love had survived, buried beneath years of silence and pain. The nurse returned with a small cardboard box. "These were her personal things," she said gently. "She insisted they be given only to you." He took the box with both hands, almost afraid to open it. Inside were only a few items: an old hairbrush, a worn-out paperback novel, a rosary, and a wooden jewelry box with a brass latch. He opened the box. There, carefully folded, was another letter. This one, thicker. Addressed in the same handwriting, "To Daniel, when he's ready." He unfolded the pages and began to read. She spoke of watching his life unfold from the shadows, of birthdays missed, and milestones witnessed from afar. She wrote about the night she fled from his father, the threats, the violence, and how she chose exile over danger. She apologized for the silence, but said it was the only way to keep him safe. And then came a confession. She hadn't raised him. But someone had helped her track him, send aid anonymously. Scholarships, job offers. Even people placed in his path who just happened to help at the right time. Daniel blinked. He thought those were coincidences. His first boss, who saw potential. The scholarship that came out of nowhere. The stranger who paid for his books in college. All orchestrated. All her. I wasn't in your life, she wrote, but I was always in your corner. He broke down. The past he thought was abandoned, was in fact protected. His whole life, he thought he was alone. But someone had always loved him enough to stay invisible. The last line of the letter read, "If I never get to hug you again, I hope you feel this one every time the wind brushes your cheek." He closed his eyes. And for the first time in years, he smiled. 2 days had passed since the hospice visit, but Daniel hadn't returned home. Instead, he booked a small room at a roadside inn near Bayport. Something kept him there, a pull, like unfinished business whispering in the wind. The box of his mother's belongings sat on the table, untouched, since he read her final letter. Every now and then, he'd glance at it, half expecting something else to reveal itself. That afternoon, a knock echoed at his door. Daniel opened it slowly. An elderly man stood there, tall, wearing a tan coat and leaning on a wooden cane. His eyes, deep brown and sharp, locked onto Daniel's with unnerving familiarity. "Are you Daniel Hill?" the man asked. Daniel hesitated. "Yes," the man nodded. "She told me you might still be here." He introduced himself as Thomas. "A friend," he said. But something in his posture, in his voice, it hinted at something deeper. They sat by the window, where the late sunlight painted everything gold. "I met your mother 38 years agosto," Thomas began. "We were both running from different kinds of pain." Daniel listened, unsure where this was going. "She never stopped talking about you," the old man continued. "Even when the pain was too much, even when her memory faded, you were her anchor." Then came the revelation. "I was there the night she left," Thomas said. "I helped her escape." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "She didn't just run, she was hunted. And I was the one who promised her, if anything ever happened to her, I'd find you, deliver her story, her truth." He pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "She wrote everything in here, things she never dared put in a letter." Daniel took the book with reverence. As Thomas stood to leave, he placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You didn't lose her, son, you found her, just in time to know the truth." And then, as quietly as he came, the man was gone. Daniel sat there, no book in hand, as the weight of everything settled in. This wasn't just a story of abandonment. It was a legacy of survival, of sacrifice, of love hidden behind silence. And this story was only just beginning to unfold. Daniel waited until the sky turned navy and the world outside his window dissolved into shadows. Then, with trembling hands, he opened the leather-bound notebook Thomas had given him. The pages were yellowed, the ink slightly smudged, as if tears had blurred the words while they were being written. The first sentence stopped him cold. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it in time. But maybe, just maybe you did." Each entry was a window into her soul. Margaret had written it like a diary, a lifeline thrown across time. She wrote about watching Daniel grow from afar, how she celebrated silently each time she heard of his achievements, and how she ached on the nights she couldn't be there. She spoke of guilt like it was a second skin. How many nights she spent replaying that last moment at the train station, wondering if a different choice could have spared them both a lifetime of absence. She described the loneliness, how even in rooms full of people, her heart beats only for one name, Daniel. And then, she wrote about Thomas, not as a lover, but as a protector. A man who gave her shelter when the world shut its doors. He helped her find work, safety, and slowly rebuild a life from the wreckage of fear. One page stood out. It detailed the years she tried to come back. Letters she wrote and never sent. Gifts she bought and kept in a drawer. Attempts to reach out to relatives, only to be shut down by shame or rejection. Daniel read until dawn, devouring every line like oxygen. He laughed at her jokes, cried at her regrets, and smiled at the sketches she had drawn of the two of them. What they might have looked like side by side, even though they hadn't shared a photo in decades. At the very end of the notebook was a single question, underlined, "Will you forgive me?" Daniel closed the book, pressing it to his chest. "Yes," he whispered aloud, "to no one and everyone. Yes, I already have." With the notebook still clutched in his hand, Daniel stood once more at the Bayport train station. 30 years had passed, but the structure remained nearly unchanged. Same iron columns, same cracked tiles, same distant scent of diesel and salt in the air. This was where everything began, and where, in a way, everything ended. The platform was nearly empty, just as it had been that night his mother left. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the space, imagining her desperate, terrified, glancing back one last time before disappearing into the dark. But today, there was no fear. Only silence, and a strange peace. He sat on a bench letting the wind pass through him like memory. In his pocket was the photo she had sent, the only picture he now owned of her face in adulthood. He placed it beside him, as if letting her sit there, one last time. Daniel spoke softly. "I used to hate this place," he admitted, "thought it stole you from me. But now, I get it." A train passed, its horn low and mournful. He didn't flinch. Just watched. "I understand what you were running from, and what you were running toward." He pulled out the letter, the first one, the one she had written before she died. He unfolded it slowly and read it again, not with the eyes of a son filled with anger, but of a man filled with understanding, and then he did something unexpected. He stood, walked to the edge of the platform, and let the wind take the letter. It lifted gently, dancing for a moment before floating away, over the tracks, into the trees, like a soul set free. A symbolic goodbye, but also a beginning. Because Daniel knew now, the story didn't end with her absence. It continued with his presence. He had spent decades searching for missing pieces. Now, finally, he felt whole. The days that followed moved differently. Slower, quieter. As if the world had exhaled alongside Daniel. Back at this small inn, he sat by the window at sunset, the notebook resting open beside a half-empty cup of coffee. He wasn't reading it anymore. He had memorized the pages. Instead, he was listening. Not to the noise outside, but to something deeper. A whisper inside. For so long, Daniel had carried a hole where a voice should have been. A mother's voice, soft, soothing, familiar. He never knew how she sounded. No recordings, no calls, just silence. But something strange was happening now. Each time he closed his eyes, he began to hear her. Not audibly, but in rhythm, in tone. Through the words in her journal. Through the way she formed sentences. He imagined how she might have spoken to him as a boy. How she would have said his name, comforted him when he was afraid, cheered for him when he succeeded. He smiled, then laughed quietly to himself. "This is crazy," he muttered, but it wasn't. Grief had turned into memory. And memory, into voice. He stood and walked to the small mirror above the sink. He stared at himself. Not critically, not with sorrow, but with something new. Recognition. In the curve of his cheekbones he saw hers. In the softness of his eyes, he saw the woman who once held him, and never stopped loving him. He whispered, "Hi, Mom." And in the stillness, he imagined her replying, "Hi, sweetheart." For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he belonged to someone. Not biologically, he always had that. But emotionally, spiritually, the silence that had once defined him no longer hurt. It had become music, a song written between the lines, a voice that lived in pages, in memory, in soul. And now it lived in him. Weeks later, Daniel returned home, not as the same man who had left, but as someone rebuilt, word by word, memory by memory. His apartment felt unfamiliar at first. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, but the air had changed. Or perhaps he had. He unpacked slowly, placing the notebook on a shelf beside family albums. Then, he sat at his desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. Not to Margaret. That letter had already been received in the silence between pages. This one was for someone else. To whoever reads this, he began, maybe you've lost someone too. Maybe they left before you had the chance to say the things you held inside. I know that feeling, I lived it. Asterisco, his pen moved steadily, no hesitation. He wrote about pain, forgiveness, discovery. About how sometimes, closure doesn't come from answers, but from choosing to understand what we'll never fully know. I used to think that healing required the other person to come back, but sometimes, healing is you coming back to yourself. He didn't know who would ever read it, maybe no one. Maybe someday, it would sit in a drawer like Margaret's letters, or maybe it would find its way into someone's hands, someone like him. He folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. On the front he simply wrote, "To the one still searching." Then he walked outside, crossed the street to the old neighborhood library, and tucked it inside a donated book. No name. No return address. Just like hers. As he stepped back into the sunlight, Daniel smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally been found. Peace, not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet, steady peace. And in that moment, under a sky that seemed to shine a little softer, he knew. Some letters don't need to be sent, they just need to be written.